All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. On the program, we return to the country of Mexico, so it's our All Things Latin America edition, and we welcome back our returning champion, Jay Watts. Jay was the central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada. He's been based now in Mexico for 3 years, where he's a photographer, and I consider him to be a historian, and he's a leftist activist and a member of Mexico Solidarity. And we'll be looking at the first 100 days of Mexico's current leftist president, Claudia Sheinbaum of the Moreno Party. And let's get straight to let's get straight to it. But firstly, Jay, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Happy to talk about what's happening here. And I guess I don't know when this will go out, but lots of big news happening with the Mexico-US relationship. So I'll try to avoid making any predictions because I'll probably be shown to be totally off
Well,
base. But we
well,
can
well,
discuss that too.
Jay, it's always hard to have you on because especially because I learned so much from you. And sadly, we've talked about this before, but sometimes, even the best left-leaning or anti-imperialist websites that even focus on Latin American affairs, simply, have not been really covering Mexico and a lot of the positive developments that's been going on there, with the
Mhm.
exceptions of some outlets like Orinoco Tribune. But before we talk about the incredible first 100 days of Claudia Sheinbaum, of course, what's been dominating the news outlets from junk journalism of corporate press and Western press to the indie left outlets to the nonprofit left-leaning media outlets is, of course, Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who, of
Mhm.
course, violated, international law by threatening to take Denmark's colony of Greenland away from them, making all of Canada part of the US and threatening to take the Gulf of Mexico and the Panama Canal. Many for bizarre reasons, blah 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 blah. But we have to talk. But I wanted to talk about this aspect, these two aspects of Trump's threats and the very bizarre response of Canada and the very funny and smart response of Claudia. Because so talk to us about both about some of Canada's right wing premier's responses
Mhm.
and TVO, which is the local state media outlet of Ontario, and the CBC's response to Trump's threats, which I think are bizarre to say the least. When you compare that to Claudia's response, which has not only been hilarious, but anyone who has a post-colonial Marxist understanding of international affairs, and anyone who is devoted to Latin America's solidarity and that of Mexico would have gotten a good crash course into the real history between Mexico and the U.S. So what did they miss out when Claudia, you know, had this huge press conference and she explained, well, if America is going to colonize Mexico, this is actually how Mexico and the U.S. should be called. And she had a very good, very witty and just historically fact oriented response to Trump's threats of taking the Gulf of Mexico. So talk to us about that before we get to the first 100 days.
Yeah. So I guess I'll work from the beginning, which is when Trump initially started talking about tariffs being put on Canada and Mexico is prior to his inauguration. The immediate response from Canadian politicians and not just on the, well, she's on the right too as well, but Chrystia Freeland, who was the finance minister, for example, at that time, she's since resigned slash been demoted, and is running for leadership of the Liberal Party of Canada, which I think is totally impossible for her to get, but we'll see what happens there. Uh, the response was this. It was, how could the United States do this? Canada's so important. We do everything for you. Stop treating us like these dirty Mexicans, was basically what they were saying. And like legitimately straight up, as you mentioned, the other right-wing premiers, Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario from the Progressive Conservative Party, people who maybe don't watch or know too much about Canadian news will remember he is the brother of Rob Ford, who was the Toronto mayor, crack smoking mayor, now since departed, who was racist and terrible and sort of a tragic figure. Doug Ford is his dumber, meaner, well, maybe not dumber. He's definitely meaner brother who is now the Premier of Ontario, and he has explicitly said like this is insulting. You're like to compare us to Mexico? Come on. This is racist shit like that. Same with Daniel
Exactly.
Smith, who's the premier from Alberta, but also the NDP Premier Wapkinu, who's from Manitoba, which is just literally a disaster of a province, has incredible rates of child poverty, unemployment, um, and despite having NDP governments for like quite a long time, if you want to see the farce of Canadian social democracy, you can just see NDP governments provincially. And he also went off on some tirade and we've got to support our military more and that's Trump will like us, et cetera, et cetera. So the all of the responses were
And I actually
yeah,
I have to interrupt just interject that really breaks my balls, not my heart, but it really breaks my balls to hear an effing indigenous like former journalist like Wap Canoe who I remember actually have like his I have like his CBC DVD docu
yeah,
series where he's educating people about like indigenous people in Canada and like indigenous and like settler relations, and like to see him just like and just to see him defend like the state of Israel, to see him like
yeah, yeah.
defending the police and like showering more money with the police and stuff like that, and not even like merge mental health care with Canada's existing quasi single payer healthcare system, and also just him like recycling, like just like as you mentioned, also like recycling like garbage about like Canada needs to like you know uh spend more money on the military. It's just like, oh wow.
Yeah, I mean, he even before he joined the NDP, it said like, oh, if I was a politician, I'd be a conservative, et cetera, et cetera. He's like, it's not. I don't know enough about his background to say, but I don't. I mean, it's not uncommon. I don't think that there's no sort of pan-indigenous leftist identity in Canada. There's lots of indigenous people who do make money through traditional sort of, or not, no, maybe not traditional, but bourgeois activities, let's say, because since there's been land claim agreements and things like that, there's people in my own family related to that. Like it's not it's that identity doesn't always guarantee it's unfortunate. It doesn't always guarantee good progressive politics. And I also think like you don't get to be the premier of a province unless toe the line on a business friendly, American friendly sort of platform. So there was that sort of disjointed but sort of shocked response. Again, Chrystia Freeland, trying to say like don't put tariffs on us, like do it on Mexico. They're a backdoor to China. She was asked, okay, she said they said, she had said that there's car plants down here and they're exporting to the United States or importing to the United States, BYD or something like that. Somebody asked her, oh, like we've never heard of this. Where is this plant? And she's well, like, blah blah blah, like change the subject, obviously lying. I mean, I don't give a shit if there was anyways, but the other thing too is that like, yeah, there's lots of Chinese EVs here, and it's because the domestic market is growing, because Chinese EVs are cheaper and more reliable. They're smaller, and there's a need. I don't like cars at all, but there's a need within Mexico for people to have cars, and you're not going to buy a $90,000 American truck. You're going to buy a very cheap, reliable BYD electric car if you're able to, and so people buy them here. Um, which is fine. Like and also we can talk about this a little later. That gets to part of the announcements that Claudia Sheinbaum's been making about vehicles and transportations here as well too. Anyways, all to say, like I feel, I mean, I'm gonna get hit twice here because I'm Canadian in Mexico and I work and make Canadian money and bring it to and also, work in Mexico. So both the country I live in and the country I'm from are getting tariffs slapped on as of tomorrow, apparently. But I think that you can see I don't know, and we're going to see. I don't know enough to definitively say, but I think that Mexico has dealt with this a lot better. It hasn't panicked. Mexico's already dealt with Trump, and it has dealt with Biden before. Biden interfering in Mexican politics, like explicitly funding the right wing opposition. This is not. It's not new. So I don't. You don't see a lot of panic here. Maybe there should be more panic. Maybe Trump is going to be way worse in his second term for Mexico. Certainly, the notion of declaring cartels terrorist organization opens the doors to like major violations of sovereignty, some of which already happened under Biden. They did come in here and, basically kidnapped one of the organized crime group leaders and brought him back to the United States. There's Mexico still has no idea how that happened. That's a major violation of sovereignty. I'm sure Trump would do more. But there's not a lot of panic here, I don't think. And even when it comes to, like lots of Mexican migrants are probably going to be the victims of ICE raids and return here. There's programs being set up for that. This is in stark contrast to Canada. Canada's in a serious like the prime minister is basically, I don't know if he's said anything since Trump announced that he's gonna do stuff like he should be out in front. Sheinbaum, carrying on the tradition of AMLO, does a daily press conference, is asked about these things, says about these things. So even though I think the capacity of the Canadian state is much larger. It's a richer country. It's much larger to deal with what Trump is going to do. The ability or willingness to do is not there, and I think Mexico is going to be able to deal with. Mexico is going to get hard harder, but be able to deal with it better because Canada is not it's that's why we see this incredulousness. They're like, "Well, we do everything you want." Like, well, how do we? Should we do more? We'll do more. We'll spend more on the military, which is what Trump is like demand what he wants, right? Like he's squeezing ostensible U.S. allies as a form of discipline, as a form of like ensuring that to strengthen U.S. imperialism. I think, and Canada's just like, but we're like we're your friends. So, and I don't know how it's going to end up, but yeah. Oh, I think you're muted.
All right, we're back on 1+1 talking about Claudia Scheinbaum's first 100 days and all the crazy stuff that's going on with Donald Trump in power. So Jay, before we got interrupted, uh, I remember you were posting something hilarious on your social media, which was which was TVO's The Agenda with Steve Pelkin, one of the anyways, I won't give my opinions on the show, but it's an awful program, and it's really sad that people get a lot of Canadians and international audience get their information from a show like that, thinking that they're being informed, and really they're not. But you said the following that Canada lost its shit over some Chinese balloon, and recently, the Canadian states concluded that there was no real Chinese interference in Canada's sacred elections, but they do think that the deep state needs to get more involved in protecting Canada from non-existent Chinese Russian interference.
Yeah, yeah.
And then so here you have TVO and even the CBC, which I watch sometimes because I follow Canadian topics, so I have to sometimes read and watch mainstream media outlets in Canada.
Mhm.
And they've been talking about Donald Trump's threats of annexing all of Canada and making Canada part of a greater United States manifest destiny as what would be the pros and the cons of us being part of the United States?
Yeah, like I don't know. I'm of two minds there, and I think you had Tyler Shipley on before, and he was talking about sort of Canadian nationalism, and obviously that exists. The Liberal Party had a big project of the Just Society of Multiculturalism in the 1960s, but I also think there's a very significant part of the Canadian ruling class, which is in the Liberal Party, which does want to merge with the United States. I think they want that to happen with a managed transition. And I think one of the big issues, I mean, Diane Francis and the National Post, people have written about this for years. It's not too secret, but I think it's never been explicitly stated. I mean, they talk about economic integration of North America. This is what NAFTA is supposed to work for. In Mexico, that was the sort of neoliberal dream, was they saw NAFTA as a way to, as not so much a trade agreement, as a way to incorporate Mexico into the United States. Canada, I think, saw NAFTA as a way to um, as sort of a corporate bill of rights, as a way to push through changes in the Canadian economy that they wouldn't be able to push through the legislature. So people saw NAFTA as different ways, but I think they also saw it as a segment of the Canadian ruling class as a way to integrate economically with the United States. They want to do that while maintaining their privileges, et cetera, et cetera. So just being annexed by Donald Trump is not the way they want to do it. And it also has the possibility of instigating the sort of long dormant Canadian nationalist feeling, um, which, as
Which
Michael
is a mix,
Ignatieff was fond,
yeah,
Michael,
which is a mixed bag when we talk about when we talk about Canadian left nationalism, like the Waffles and I'm blanking on his name, but there was a very well-known, Canadian left nationalist who was always railing against how we're about how the U.S. Colonizes the hell out of us. And there is that feeling that like we're already a colony of the United States. Look at how they ousted John Diefenbaker, even if we're not supporters of the PC. Look how they ousted him, put Lester
so,
Pierce in office. And then there's and then I think for a lot of like Canadian right nationalists, it's like yeah, we think Brian Mulroney's ideas of like the U.S. free trade agreement and then NAFTA, which was that on steroids, it's a good idea, but he completely sold us out, and America got the upper hand. But yeah,
well, I mean, there is a sort of old red Tory progressive conservative sort of looking to Britain kind of thing that's sort of gone now, I guess. David Orchard was a farmer from the prairies who ran to be the leader of the progressive conservatives and was the one who did the merger with McKay, and ostensibly it was to like maintain some sort of like right-wing nationalism like against the United States. That doesn't really exist anymore. Um, I mean, and for me, like, is left-wing nationalism good? No, but I think strategically, I think it's better that Canada, it's better for people in Canada, for the left in Canada, for working people, for Indigenous people in Canada, if the levers of power remain closer to them. I don't, like if Canada is annexed by the United States, I'm not one of these people who think, oh, that means, the working class gets just as strong or something like that. And so I very much disagree with the idea. Like there's international unions. Canada has unions which they share, like the United Steelworkers with the United States, which are headquartered in the United States. And when something like this comes up, when the United States is economically more powerful, has more people, where do you think these unions are going to come down on the side of? They're not going to support a dual working class struggle, and I think there's a bunch of bullshit about that sort of stuff. I think they're also trying to do that with Mexican unions, honestly. I don't think that's good. I think my opinion is that Mexico is in a very dangerous position right now, but has a lot of opportunity. The opportunity, thankfully, Morena's in power, has a lot of support behind it, but it's totally reliant on the United States. And it's not in a position, even with all the strengthening of its domestic market, to be able to say fuck you to the United States. It can't just be like, we're trading with China. No, Mexico is where it is right now because it's absorbing a lot of investment that previously would have gone to low-wage manufacturing in China or in other countries, the nearshoring like experiment, right? So that also gives a bit of room, right? Is that, the United States depends so much on Mexico for manufacturing that yes, there's tariffs and stuff like that. It's going to hurt Mexico. It's going to hurt Americans a lot. I think a little more than Canada, maybe. Um, But so what's like, how do we think of the Canadian response? Is a Canadian, it's already provoking something of a nationalist response. I think that, like, as Tyler had mentioned, this is very good for the Liberal Party. They're going to be able to like sort of turn the page on Trudeau with maybe probably Mark Carney. Pierre Poilievre is not going to look too good if he looks too aligned to Trump, even if people hate Trudeau and stuff like that. I think Michael Ignatieff actually famously applied Freud's idea to the Balkans of narcissism of minor differences. Like, I don't think it was accurate, but I think in Canada it is. Like so much of Canadian identity is like we're not the United States. Like we're basically the United States, but we're not the United States.
Exactly.
So like that's like so close to the United States. So activating that, like that's like people are very upset. And so is that good? I guess so. I mean, I don't think it is good if the United States annexes Canada. I think that that makes the United States a lot stronger. I think at every moment I think the US is the dominant imperialist power. It is the enemy. So the more complicated and sticky its relationships with its allies and enemies get, without being extremely violent or going into war, the better it is. I think it's a better situation. It's better, certainly better for Indigenous people if the levers of power are closer to them. If the United States has this giant landmass as that, they're going to be, the aggression will be a lot more naked, and the ability of Canada to like resist something like that. Like, I don't think there's going to be like
Exactly,
Canadians go to war or whatever.
exactly. And people have to read our good friend Eve Engler's brilliant book, "Stand on Guard from Whom: A People's History of the United States Military," because so much of like Canadian military and where Canada even gets its weapons from is
And
because of the fact that like
this is the
that
other thing
Canada is kind
too.
of like a vassal state to the American
And and
empire.
and I see a bunch of like there's a bunch of like people who should know better being totally deluded about what NATO is, being like, well, NATO is going to step. NATO is just a creation of the United States. Like it's not this idea that NATO exists because whatever Mark Rutte is the president, that means that it's actually more of like a European social democrat. No, it's like it is a tool of US imperialism. The reason you have something called NATO interoperability with weapons is so the United States can control your military. Like, and so the idea that like, oh, we just won't buy American weapons, we'll buy German weapons. Like, no, they're also like the United States knows how to deal with those. You're not gonna like trick them.
I wish I could say that I'm shocked at people who should know better saying stupid stuff like that. But at this point in my life, I should not be shocked. Like it's amazing how just well, yeah. The imperial blind spots and the grand delusions Westerners have of themselves is quite is quite unbelievable. But that's exactly why we should talk about Claudia Sheinbaum's response to when Trump was making all these threats. So she had this great presentation, and it really pisses me off that the Western corporate press, from the Guardian and so forth, have not shown this presentation in its entirety, because she
Yeah.
gave a really good presentation about how. Anyways, well, talk about it because I can't I can't even like say what she said, which was mostly in Spanish, about how if if America becomes part of Mexico, it should be called taken away from there.
Yeah, Americana, Mexicana or America Mexicana, because of like, I grew up in British Columbia. There's the Strait of Juan de Fuca there. There's lots of other places with Spanish names. It's because Spanish colonization reached there first before Anglo-Germanic, whatever, US sort of like settler colonization, right? So yeah, I mean, her joke is like, if you're going to change the name of that, then, and she sent a letter to Google as well. It was like, the United States took giant chunk of what was formerly Mexico and was named like that over a period of time. I mean, that's the crazy thing about like trying to deport uh people in the United States. There's an entire Chicano nation. There's people, Spanish-speaking people there who were there before Anglos got there. Now, I don't think like I also like I understand that like Mexican nationalism has a progressive character because it is anti-imperialist. There's also some weird stuff about, like the Raza Mexicana, like the Mexican race being like above all the racial struggle because it's united the Spanish, the indigenous, and like the mestizo. Like that's a
Uh-huh.
little bit of bullshit sometimes. And so this stuff gets into that. Like it's a got ya. So I'm not I think it's a little funny, but I also like I really like Claudia Sheinbaum, but I also like I don't want to pretend that she has the best sense of humor because sometimes it's like she made a reference about like oh like Breaking Bad and I'm like this is like old people joke like okay like I get it like are people so starved for somebody saying something back they're like it wasn't the funniest when people are like Breaking Bad yeah like okay come on let's like
But
I
I
don't know
but actually, I think that just goes to show. But I think that also just goes to show you just how how much American culture, whether you like it or not, how much of that also penetrates into not just a country like Mexico, but globally. I mean,
yeah
you go. You go to Netflix. I try to watch whatever Japanese, Korean TV series or movie that sometimes comes on there, or whatever international film goes on there. But at the end of the day,
yeah
you're still being bombarded with Hollywood productions, and even the supposedly indie films are all just like an extension of that American culture. Saheli Chowdhury of Orinoco Tribune, based in India. We had a long, amusing conversation about how much like Americanism, the mentality of like working yourself to death and making your
Mhm.
kids like go to making your kids do all these like competitive music stuff and competitive sports things because you want them to get into an overpriced like American college. She talks about how like a
yeah
lot of that has been happening like in India, and then you see it in places
Mm.
like in Korea or like in Korea or Japan. Yes, they have their culture, and their culture does sometimes get exported into America, which is why so many Americans like love all things Japan and are just like hostile and shit on all things China. But still, Americanism, imperialism, and American cultural imperialism has penetrated those things. So yeah, so I didn't know that Claudia Schiffer like said something about like Breaking Bad, but if she says something like that, that's just because American culture just penetrates into everything and anything. And even if people aren't watching it submissively by reading like, subtitles, it's translated, it's dubbed and so forth. And so that's but that being said, I think like it really I think Claudia's response was fantastic because here she is giving like people like a basic history lesson that like America stole our country. So like like California, New Mexico, Utah, and when the Texas all used to be like Mexican. So I just thought it was very funny how like she was like saying like yeah it should be called like Mexico America or Mexico like Americana because like so I'm curious your
yeah
response to that.
I mean, it's funny. I live the neighborhood that I live in here in Mexico City, just up the street. There's a place called the Museum of Intervention. A friend of mine, actually, who was an actor in Narcos Mexico. Speaking of speaking of Netflix, he said ironically, he's like this. Mexico's the only country in the world that would like have a museum dedicated to all the wars it's lost. But but it's primarily because there's been well I mean France, Germany and stuff too, but primarily like 40 plus interventions by the United States in Mexico like over the years. It's that's hence the Porfirio Diaz thing. Mexico's like close to God but so close to the United States kind of thing. That's the reality. And so because of that, I think and because of the experience dealing with Trump in his first term, there's not as much panic here. Also, people have lived in like intense hardship over the neoliberal period. Like it's been super violent. It's been horrible. It's been really ghastly, and it's not right now. And there's also like, you know, if it does get hard, that I think and hope that this government, this party, uh, if it's truly committed to what it says, which is the end of neoliberalism, I think it has to show that in crisis because it is very easy when trade's going well, when investment is coming, when the wage differential is so extreme between the United States and Mexico, it's easy to like, okay, we're raising the minimum wage. Okay, it's still super low. They still don't have a 40-hour work week. It's 48 hours. Mexicans work like an obscene amount of
Wow.
time. Like people are extremely exploited here, right? So there's a giant capacity for the government to do stuff here and corporations still to profit. But the real test of this comes what happens with an economic crisis or something that, has happened with dealing with Trump and stuff. I think people are have a lot of hope, and that's why Claudia has approval and stuff, and the ability for her to communicate every day, unlike Justin Trudeau, who knows where the hell he is right now. But every workday, like AMLO, she's like out there answering questions directly and stuff. Um, so I think there's a good possibility that I don't want it to be tested, but it has to be. And I think eventually the reality too is that eventually even if there weren't any tariffs coming, the thing is the US that Mexico depends so much on the US market. And I think fundamentally US capitalism is in crisis and that it's not going to continue very well, very longer. That's why Trump is around too. And so something along was going to come anyways to test this relationship.
And
We,
actually,
we, you know,
one last thing I wanted to talk to you about before we talk about Claudia Scheinbaum's first 100 days, which I think is which is very important. But one last thing I want to talk to you about is Canada's relations with Mexico. Now, if anyone follows the history presented to us by our friend Eve Engler, also
Mhm.
Richard Sanders, Tyler Shipley, and other historians and journalists in the and other historians and journalists in the past who've been suppressed by popular Canadian academic and journalism, is the history of Canada, like the U.S., has an imperial foreign policy towards Mexico and the Americas, and not just the Americas, but also globally. Now, when leftists, often Western leftists, American-based leftists, when they cover NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, much of the focus is how the U.S. shipped countless and a huge variety of jobs overseas to Mexico. Multinationals exploited Mexican workers who had little to no workers' rights, and they were used as cheap labor, and all while countless of industrialized places in the U.S. Were left with huge destitute levels of poverty, like
Mhm.
destitution. Now, can you talk to us about how that happened in Canada too, and how that changed in a positive way, at least for Mexico, when AMLO came into power and was allowed for as long as voters gave him a mandate to address the grievances of Mexican workers who worked for Canadian multinationals who engaged in similar practices the U.S. Did with respect to NAFTA.
Yeah, so I mean, I think an interesting and weird and funny thing that people might not know is Canada and Mexico have only had relations since 1944 or something like that. So like 80 years, and that's because of because of independence and Mexican Independence War, and then the Revolution, and then the nationalization of oil companies here, which Canada was not very happy about. So it's actually a very like recent relationship in the diplomatic sense of the word. And I don't think a very positive one. I think that, I mean, you've probably seen the meme. It goes around quite a bit. It's not just for Mexico, but it's very popular in Mexico, which is, when Canada visits you, or when you visit Canada, there's somebody, on a lake seeing beautiful mountains and stuff. And then when Canada visits you, there's an open pit mine. So that's how people experience Canada here, or they experience it as as one of the companies that has the maquiladoras on the border and exploits the workforce. It's not very positive. I don't think, and I don't think it's. I think the most recent thing, like AMLO did pause relations, diplomatic relations with, and said the ambassador couldn't do anything after they interfered over the issue of judicial reform here. And basically, what it was Ken Salazar, the American ambassador, was who initially said he was fine with the judicial reform, then started like speaking out against it. Basically, just to, very quickly, the judicial reform was they're going to be electing judges here, which is amazing because this is one of the issues where politically the progressive government, the left government here has faced issues trying to pass things. Was that they can get things called amparos, which are basically injunctions which stop them from being able to fine a Canadian mining company or do things like that. So that judicial reform passed. They'll be electing judges here. Anyways, the United States was very against that. Business people are against it because they've spent years, buying judges basically, and now they're not going to have that certainty. So, so immediately Canada also sent a letter that was like a carbon copy, and AMLO was like, "You guys are a vassal state. Like, I'm gonna slap you on the wrist." But to get back to NAFTA. Yeah, a lot of the situation was jobs. Jobs also left Canada. They carved out certain unions, like the auto workers and stuff like that, carved out deals, fucked over a lot of other manufacturing jobs in Canada. That's a whole other issue too. Jobs went south, so even Detroit was destroyed around that process too as well. Auto worker jobs went south in Mississippi and right to work states, and then they also went across the border. So lots of manufacturing just shifted southways, and Canadian companies were involved in maquiladoras here and stuff like that. So uh, it's not a positive experience. How did what why? Okay, here's a good question. Is like for a long time the Canadian position, the Canadian left, reformist left position was to get out of NAFTA. The
Yeah,
Council of
yeah,
Canadians organization, which was probably the last really big
left
non-union
nationalist
left
organization.
nationalist group, that was their position. The last one, they were like, no, we just have to negotiate different terms. Certainly in Mexico, the idea was NAFTA was terrible, it's awful. However, Morena, under the last time it was negotiated was the period between Peña Nieto and AMLO. Peña Nieto, for whatever reasons, thankfully, allowed Morena and AMLO to negotiate that renegotiation. Even it happened before they took office. So they were able to carve out certain things like the ability and here it comes to like Trump wanted wages up here. He didn't want wages up because he cares about Mexican workers, because he thinks that if wages go up here, jobs won't come down from there. It looks good, right? The rapid response mechanism for labor violations, etc. So Mexico was able to carve out certain things that Trump saw as a good deal for him, but were actually better for Mexico. Mexico already wanted to do that. They don't want to be a low wage jurisdiction, right? Or the government doesn't, anyways. Um, and there's also things like which are probably I have to actually check if this extends to Canada too, which are like if the Constitution is the highest thing of law in Mexico, so this trade agreement can't override that. I perhaps it's the same with Canada, but I don't know. And they'll never be tested because Canada's just such a shit show that they would never be able to like get their act together. And as we've seen multiple times with attempts at constitutional reform. So,
That's
for
true. That's
example,
true.
one of the trade issues right now is that corn is over GMO corn. Mexico does not want to import GMO corn from the United States. Mexico shouldn't import any corn from the United States. It's the fucking people of the corn here, anyways. So the United States under Biden and I assume under Trump and stuff is very upset about this. They want the market. Um, I don't think it's that significant, but it's probably like a symbolic thing as well too, because they force their crappy corn on people down here. However,
Exactly.
so like many other things, now that Morena has essentially a supermajority in Congress and in the Senate and most of the governments of the states in Mexico, it can put things through the Constitution. So she said, okay, like you're forcing it on us, we're just going to put a constitutional reform. So that's one of the things that's being announced. Like we can just do these things because we have the support of the people here. So the extremely negative, horrific aspects of the USMCA are can be ameliorated in this using this particular mechanism. So at this point, there's not such a hostility as there has been historically towards NAFTA slash USMCA because the government is able to sort of like go around it in many ways. Then
Fascinating.
I so I mean there's bigger problems with it too, and we see like like for example, the USMCA has provisions about dealing with non-market economies, which means Vietnam and China. Obviously, the trend internationally and just for the sovereignty of most countries is that they want to deal with China more than the United States. So that's an issue that has to be dealt with. I think that there's I don't know. I mean, it's these things are going to come up in the renegotiation, and I think that's also why Trump is doing these tariffs and stuff like that, is to like win some sort of things at the USMCA bargaining. And somebody else mentioned this, and I don't know if it's entirely true as well, but we can also think about certain like drug war events as being sort of like when the efficiency expert comes into town. Like the United States intelligence agencies, the reason Mexico has cartels, organized crime groups, it's because of the United States. It's because the United States put them in there during the Dirty War in the 1970s against the communist insurgency. These crime groups are connected to international finance capital. They give the sort of like black funding for US intelligence services. Mexico will never, unfortunately, be able to deal with that. So if Trump is talking about fentanyl and declaring war on this and stuff like that. There's two things that work, I think. There's obviously appealing to the base. There is a crisis of like drug use in the United States. It's killing a lot of people. It's obvious. It has to do something about it, or it's be seen to be doing something about it. And then the second thing I think is a rationalization of the supply, and maybe things are just getting too unwieldy. Maybe they need to be like, okay, now we need one monopolistic crime group that we can say this is the group. I mean, this is what Bukele is doing in El Salvador, is when he's declaring war on certain crime groups, it's for the benefit of one crime group that the state is integrated in against the others. So we'll see how that plays out.
It's gonna be, and that's where it's gonna be very interesting to see Claudia Scheinbaum's response. And now, unfortunately, having had this conversation with some of my Latin American comrades who are based in Brazil, Venezuela, and so forth, you got to stop the drug war, but there is this socially conservative blind spot which is very deep in many people's minds. Just like whether we like it or not, a lot of Latin Americans are practicing Catholics and so forth like that. So there is a little bit of that social conservatism that still comes into the mindset of people, which is why not many leftists run on. We're going to have queer liberation and abortion, and on top of that, we're gonna raise your wages and so forth like that. So it's gonna be interesting how Claudia Scheinbaum responds to that. That's a perfect segue then for this, which is tell us. She's been in office for 100 days, and my
Mhm.
God, just like AMLO, she doesn't miss a beat in terms of progressive reforms she passes. So tell us some of the major important reform and landmark left wing policies she's passed since even before she came into power. And yeah, and what are some of the policies she's passed in her 100 days that the Mexican working class and the precarious middle class are celebrating?
Yeah, so I think her and Clara Brugada, who's the head of government of Mexico City, have mentioned that sort of one of the guiding things in Morena under AMLO was for the good of all, but first of all, the poor, meaning if you help the poor, it's going to like, you know, help build the domestic market, help everybody, basically lift everybody up. And we've seen that
Like
in
reverse trick, like reverse trickle ups, trickle
yeah,
up
basically,
economics.
basically. Yeah, basically, and in this circumstance, it has. But also, so with Claudia and Claire Bugada as well, there's been more of an emphasis on, okay, well then, also women. Women are the most exploited. Women endure the most in Mexican society. So one of the things that they did was drop the pension age of women from 65 to 60 now. So they're rolling that out right now. That's a really good thing. That's gonna bring a lot of people. So I mean, you see this like they've been dragging their heels on the hourly issue. That is that there's still a 48-hour work week. Most people work 6 days a week, a lot of stuff like that. But you've seen they on the margins do certain things. So they've ensured that everybody gets 2 weeks of vacation at the base, right? So that does technically reduce the hours. Okay, you're bringing the age of retirement for women down from 65 to 60. I think fundamentally they've got to bring it down to 40 hours, a little bit more, but we see there's still progress being made, even in the smaller incremental things that we might not think of as important as the reduction. They do that. So um, but yeah, there's a bunch of constitutional reforms. We had discussed that in the previous thing that AMLO had sort of advanced and that she's pushed through. That includes the judicial reform, et cetera, et cetera. The recognition of animal rights right now, that's in the Constitution.
Recognition of animal rights. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
talk a bit more about that. As somebody, I'm yeah, as someone who actually is interested in animal rights, which is a topic we don't talk about much.
Yeah.
Yeah, talk about that. That's interesting.
So they're recognized as sentient beings in the Constitution now, so they have to be treated with dignity. There's an ethical duty of treatment, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know how that's going to work out with slaughterhouses and things like that here. So
Yeah.
we'll see. And but they've established the framework anyways, and ideally there's going to be some teeth in that in terms of like, you know how that's enforced, and I like to see that. So that's one of the major things. I think that's an advance that hasn't been really done. There's a ban on fracking. Um, there's some reversals of
Wow.
stuff that's happened. So CFE and Pemex are two of the state corporate companies here. CFA is the electrical company, and so it's always been public, but there's been carve outs and sort of neoliberal reforms to it that meant it couldn't compete with private interests, et cetera, et cetera. Those have been wiped away. So now it's a totally 100% public company. And same with Pemex, which is the oil company. Then, so there's also the minimum wage, there's 12% minimum wage increase. So it's about 135% increase since Morena took power in 2018, 2019.
And so what was it originally, and like what is it now?
So there's two minimum wages basically. There's a minimum wage that that that's like at the border for people who work in maquiladoras and stuff. That's part of the USMCA too as well. I think it's about like double what it is. And right now, so it was 250 pesos and now it's 280 pesos. Very again, as you can see, this is very small. This is like the minimum wage. It's funny too. The minimum wage in Mexico is a lot smaller than the minimum wage in China. It's like about half of what it is. So, and people sometimes just don't think about that. But it's increased, and also put in the Constitution was that it has to increase every year and it has to be above the rate of inflation. So that
Exactly.
nobody will lose money, because as we know, if you don't get a raise past the rate of inflation, you're taking a pay cut. So that's put into the Constitution. Then, one of the really big and really important things, especially as we're coming into the dry season here in Mexico, is the National Water Strategy, which was announced in November. So that's guaranteeing that there's a human right to water. It's going to look at about 100,000 water concessions, which are permits, which are given away during the neoliberal period of the privatization, where companies sort of like in Canada too as well, basically pay nothing for giant amounts of water, or they sit on it, or they speculate, or they divert it away to their own corporate interests and treat it like crap. So there's also going to be looking at different treatments and stuff like that. So, one of it's always joking about coming down to Mexico and don't drink the water, et cetera, et cetera. Trying to make water potable here. So many people spend, like everybody here, you buy water jugs or you get like a really expensive filtration system. You don't drink the water from the tap, which, for me coming from Canada was very different. I'm very used to just drinking it from the tap.
Interesting.
Um, and then they're going to look at rationalizing irrigation systems. So that's the water issue is a really big one. That'll probably involve a big fight with companies who are just, sitting off of these things then. So, another thing, here's one that's being advanced, and I don't know how it's going to work out. And I think we're seeing some of the issues with platform capitalism, let's say, and Morena and how it deals with it. So
Interesting.
uh, there EAMS is the social security system here that all workers pay into, helps pay for the free childcare that workers get as well. Social security service, basically. So for up until recently, gig workers, delivery drivers, et cetera, were not covered under that. They weren't able to pay into it, so that means they don't get a pension, they don't get protections, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things. So they announced that now they would, that if you make the minimum wage in a month, that then you're enrolled in EAMS, which also unlocks
Interesting.
employer contributions, right? So employers have to pay into that. Employers pay into the Infonavit system, which is provides housing for people here. It pays for social housing, but also access to low interest mortgages. In the past, sometimes not always lower interest. So there's a lot of things, basically a regularization of irregular employment if workers want it, if they work enough. The issue is that how do you stop uh, these companies, these platforms from throttling people when they see, oh, this person is going to make the minimum wage by being like, no, we're cutting your hours and we're sending that to somebody else, right? So I don't think they've dealt with that. I haven't seen any writing about that. That's one of the issues. So the reform is technically good, but it also leaves out a very big loophole for companies
And has she
to
done
get.
anything? One of the questions I actually had prepared was any one policy passed that you particularly find important that's been overlooked by even the best of the left in Mexico and Latin America when we talk of left-leaning news outlets and independent left outlets. Actually, before you and yeah,
Yeah.
so actually answer that. And I'm curious, is there anything about internships that Claudia Sheinbaum has done where interns, where people who do internships don't get grossly exploited?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I know that there's a lot of scholarship money available for training programs, things like that. If people aren't, I mean, a bigger thing here is I think internships tend to be a bit more middle class, upper middle class.
Mm,
Um,
okay.
so I think a bigger thing here is people leave school because they have to go work rather than people are working for free at internships. So in those
Wow.
instances, and that leads to child labor, things like that. So there's lots of money available. There's new scholarships announced for any kid who's in public education, that they get money, the family gets money so that they don't have to be like, oh, the kids got to work because we have to support the family kind of thing. So there's a significant amount of money available for that. They announced 300,000 new places for public university, like higher education, which is really good because there's technically free education here, but for a long time, like at UNAM and stuff, it's been gate kept by really small spaces and it's very competitive to get into. So people pay a lot of money to, do extra tutoring in order to get in. So so even though there's technically free public education, how you access it is a class issue too as well. So
Exactly.
thankfully they've been trying to expand the spaces, give more money, do things like that that help that then. as well. So in terms of things that people have overlooked, I'd say, and we still have to see how it plays out, the indigenous and Afro-Mexican inclusion into the Constitution. My understanding is that it actually is in line with UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which, unlike in Canada, will allow a veto over energy projects or any projects that happen on Indigenous lands then and
Fascinating.
along with that there has been large amounts of land given back to certain indigenous groups. I think there's going to be a lot more with them in the constitution. There'll be legal entities that are able to exert their national rights as well that way. So I think that's one thing that's not being talked about. I think it's also not being talked about because there's an emphasis with certain groups in the left who have engaged with Mexico before to be tied either to the Zapatistas or, engaged in issues over the Maya train and stuff, which so so they're not looking at these other things. A ban on fracking is very good. A ban on open pit mining, allowing veto rights. These are good things. But I think the groups that you would know would maybe traditionally talk about something like that don't like AMLO, don't like Claudia Sheinbaum, don't like Morena. So they're not going to maybe honestly discuss those things, I would say. Um,
Unbelievable.
and and I don't and that's like I think I don't know if there's that many in my mind. I don't think that the train Maya is a gigantic issue of the exploitation of indigenous lands, et cetera, et cetera. I think that there's been a lot of nonsense thrown at it when it was a pretty above board process of checking in with people, diverting it, also building the train over land that was already had train tracks on it. It's not like a lot of the routes already existed. This is expanding it. They're making it safer. It's bigger. It's holding more. It's and if the alternative is, and I think it was a giant highway, I think it's way better to have train travel that is subsidized for local people and nationally and internationally. There's a higher rate. It's way better to have that than it is to have cars driving around on, throughout the
Yeah, no,
peninsula.
that I mean, what you just said there, it reminds me of when before Evo Morales. That's a major topic that we definitely have to do an entire show dedicated to because of the division that's going on in Bolivia between the left and the infighting. But before Evo Morales was overthrown in the Western-backed far right coup, you had just environmental groups that were just doing really stupid things, like they are recycling junk that Evo Morales was this like climate criminal and that he was infringing on the rights of certain indigenous groups because of wanting to open up a business over here and that over there. And then they all fell for these, propaganda things, which led to his ouster. And then the real climate criminals unleash their reign of terror. And I think you see similar things when it comes to Mexico coverage, where I'm not going to name any particular outlets specifically, but you just see so many outlets, including outlets that who cover American topics, and their raison d'être is we want our McDonald's workers to have a $15 minimum wage. We want our Amazon workers to have a $20 minimum wage. We should all be arguing for a living wage. And yet, all of this stuff is happening in Mexico, or some of these major policies are happening in a place like Brazil, and it just isn't being covered in these Western left wing, left leaning outlets, and then you wonder, like, is there some weird kind of jealousy that's being played there, or because, or does or does or does the particular government of Mexico or Brazil just not have a very good PR media communicator to that and the liaisons with folks like say to them, look, these are positive things that's happening. You want to I don't know cover it. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Um, I don't know. I guess it's I think since Claudia has come in and since Kamala Harris got wiped in the election, there has been a bit more look at Mexico. Some of it's kind of ridiculous. Some of it's like, oh, look, like, oh, well, here's Claudia won. Oh, great. Why, that she's like, she's Kamala or something like that, which is absolutely ridiculous. Um, so I think there is a bit more attention, and obviously with Trump and stuff like that, I also think it also tends to be personalized too, which is like it's Claudia Sheinbaum, and Claudia says herself, she's the second stage of the fourth transformation. She's part of a political party. It's a political movement. It has a program. It has an idea of what it's going to do. That stuff gets totally de-emphasized in any of the coverage that is now kind of going towards it, and I don't know. So it's still not satisfying. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm struck too because I think there's lots of lessons to be learned in Mexico, which are in certain circumstances, what are the limits of a reformist project? Like what can you do? And Mexico has shown there's quite a bit. Now the question is, does Mexico have that ability? Mexico has that ability for two reasons, because obviously the trade situation and the manufacturing, the capacity of the state to do things is very significant, having the access to the US market. It can do things that Venezuela can't, or Venezuela can do, but Venezuela gets in trouble for. Mexico can do that. And Mexico also had the social revolution in the first part of the 20th century and the Constitution, and that fundamentally it's not a liberal democracy. Property rights don't exist. The government basically owns everything, the public, and therefore the public. And there's a long history here of like recognizing that, and so petitioning the state for things, taking over a government office, asking for things, stuff like that that just doesn't fly, wouldn't fly in Canada. So I don't know how to,
Well, you know what? You know what
yeah.
it is. I've been thinking about some of the coverage of Donald Trump. I've not really been happy with a lot of the left's coverage of Donald Trump, including the best of the left, which I follow, because instead of like attacking a lot of the crazy reactionary right wing stuff that the guy is going to inflict on us, a lot of people are still stuck in there. Where were you when Obama was doing this? Well, Biden was doing this, and I didn't see you guys protesting that. And that stuff is just, I'm sorry, like I just find that very boring now to listen to. Like I get it, like both Democrats and Republicans suck. They're both genocidaires when it comes to Palestinians, and on numerous issues, there's not a dime's worth of difference, as Alexander Kilburn and Counterpunch once did an entire book about that. But Donald Trump is the president now. Can we just talk about like his policies and how to mobilize the left against it? And I think what you see sometimes with the Western left's coverage of Brazil, you see
Hmm.
this a lot with Mexico and other countries, but those two the example, but those two are the best examples where there's a nihilism in the West. We're so disappointed with with
Hmm.
our leaders, whether they're in unions, whether they're in parties like the NTP, the foolish people who keep thinking labor is going to that labor is their savior and stuff like that. So there's a lot of cynicism with the state of affairs, and yet people keep doing the same mistakes. Like instead of starting a new left party, they're still like them and their unions are still devoted to the Democrats are our savior or labor is our savior. And then when they cover, Brazil or Mexico, which okay, they may not be like as charismatic as a Hugo Chavez, and they may not like have the kind of George Galway tone of we're gonna take the Yankees by their horns and stuff like that. And I think so much of like their positive policies just gets lost in that. And then when they do one or two mistakes, either on foreign policy, like Haiti or Palestine, or when they make concessions to the right wing on this issue or that issue, their entire project is thrown as they're just like our Western leftists. They're just a bunch of sellouts, so F them. And then before you know it, they're overthrown in the right-wing coup or a right-wing constitutional coup. And then all of a sudden, the Western left like wakes up because they listen to one or two journalists that's like doing their job or half their job, like Glenn Greenwald did with Brazil. And then all of a sudden they wake up and go like, solidarity to Brazil, solidarity to Mexico, solidarity to Venezuela. Meanwhile, like it's like we've just been like deer in the headlights. I'm curious your response to that before I get to my last two
I don't know.
questions
I
when
think,
it comes to
well,
Mexico.
I think there's like, there should be, and I know for myself, I'm experiencing that somewhat of like a crisis when we think about the left and the imperial core and how it thinks of solidarity and how it enacts it when we look at what's happened in Palestine, what's happened with the genocide, right? Like I don't know if the model, well, we know it doesn't work. The model that's been done before that like Cuba and the blockade stuff, right? Like that's a lot less like, you couldn't get the United States to stop a genocide. You're
Mm.
not fundamentally going to get the United States to stop the blockade on Cuba. I don't think. I think it's impossible. You should still fight for it, I guess. But I like, so how do, and I think about this too when I think about work with Mexico solidarity, like the, which is maybe a little different because there is a gigantic population of Mexicans living in the United States. It's important, stuff like that. But sometimes it's like doing work to reach out to groups that are primarily white. Like what are we actually, yeah, it's good to show them what's happening here, to say this is worthy, you should mobilize, but like after seeing Palestine, like which mobilized a lot of people, there's a lot, and in a good way. I think Palestinian youth movement was so much better than their analysis and what they did than what if it was 10 years ago when it did happen 10 years ago. Um, but it's still like nothing, it came to nothing, right? Like, and I'm not saying this to be nihilistic, to be a doomer or whatever it is. No, I'm saying it to be critical, and I would extend this too as well to like the international communist movement, which in the past on these issues of national liberation, when parties were maybe even in worse situations sometimes, like the 1930s, with the Spanish Civil War, there was international brigades. There was all of this work being done. Now, I understand there's objectively communist parties are not as strong right now as they have been in the past, but there's lots of places that I think would that if we're anti-imperialists and communists have to look at what's just happened and ask ourselves like, what the fuck? Like,
Oh,
you
but this,
know?
well, I didn't want to bring them up. I didn't want to bring this up because it's another topic for another day. But it's like with Syria. Like the one thing I keep asking myself over and over again is, what did we do wrong in our mobilizing against Syria? Is it just that the propaganda system is so powerful? But one thing I remember talking with my friend Saheli was just like, what the fuck did like the Syrian government do to just have no solidarity amongst even the Middle East diaspora groups? And I'm still quite I myself am still quite bitter about it. So, like, and Palestine solidarity is so important. But when you see how so much of Palestine solidarity folks were cheering on the non-existent Syrian revolution, and again, you're gonna get the fake outrage brigade of, oh my gosh, like Syrian Christians are being persecuted, like what happened? And it's like, guys, really, like we're gonna do this. So it's so you have that, but then on the other
Yeah.
end, you have sometimes I see this sometimes with particular leftist friends of mine and comrades where it's just like this nonstop like doom gloom, like everything
Mhm.
sucks, the Communist Party of America sucks, this Communist Party sucks, this left wing party sucks, this one's too drunk on wokeism and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
And I find that also isn't very like inspiring. And then like before you know it, they kind of start like dabbling into like right wing territories and stuff like that. So I don't know. Yeah, so it's
But
yeah, and
yeah, and that's that's the only
that's something I'm still stumped. That's something I'm still stumped
that's
on.
that's the overall thing. I think we have to look at like what in the past, what were people doing that worked? So I mean, and I'm not suggesting that it's all horrific. I mean, there's been shipments that have been stopped in Greece. The work that Palestinian movement did regarding the Spanish government engaging in like sort of allowing secret shipments to Israel and stuff. There's good things that have been done. Um, Fundamentally, and you can say communist parties weren't in the leadership because they're too small. They're not small everywhere. There's communist parties who are in government and who are in coalition governments with governments that maintain relations with Israel. Like that should have been the most obvious, easy thing. That's something you have power over. You could have pushed for even. I didn't hear anybody suggesting that. Chile never has the communist parties in the coalition there. They never said, okay, we're cutting off. That's it. Or they never even advanced this idea that, as far as I know, maybe they did. I could be wrong. So even there's things that I thought could have been done, and there's things that just couldn't be done because things are, the groups or parties and stuff are too small. But I think this comes down to two, like what, if we're getting into a situation where there can be military action between the United States coming in invading or bombing Mexico, um, is I don't, reaching out to the left in the United States is too small. Thankfully, there is a Mexican population there. I think the Mexican government, I hope, is doing some of that just because they have to, because of the deportations and stuff like that. Opening, there's a network of consuls there. There's issues within these consuls. There have been Mexicans in the United States commonly complain. I mean, these are groups. The Foreign Affairs office is not staffed with like progressive Morena people, let's say. So hopefully that's being dealt with, and hopefully that'll lead to more
And
work
actually,
there. Yep.
actually, changing the subject because we're almost out of time. So I have to ask these two questions. But I think, long story short, our leftist needs to seriously get its shit together, and I think we have to really go back, sort of almost to the drawing board, and really explain to people like all the different intricacies that comes with imperialism, and that sometimes our solidarity is going to be with people who we ourselves may not vote for if we were in those countries, like a Hezbollah or the Ba'ath Party, for whatever stupid reason people are going to say why they would never vote for the Ba'ath Party. But it has to go back to the drawing board of uh, of Western imperialism is literally the root of all evil, and you who sit in the imperial seat, whether you're in England, whether you're in France, whether you're in the U.S., whether you're in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, whatever, your main responsibility is to keep your government in check, and to tell your leftists, whomever is in leadership, to mobilize against this imperial project going over here and the next one that's coming on over here. But when it comes to Claudia Scheinbaum's first 100 days and the 4 to 5 year term she has, how is she dealing with or coping with the often hostile corporate press in Mexico, and the state press, who are often right wingers and bootlickers for the pre and the pan party, who appoints them to their jobs? I'm curious your response on that. Okay, so yes, so Jay, how has Claudia Scheinbaum been dealing with the often hostile corporate press in Mexico, and and also and also the state press, which has historically, because the pre and the pan have been in power, they've often been the ones to appoint junk journalists who have a right wing mentality. So how has she been coping with
The communication strategy, I think it's a continuation of what AMLO was doing with the Maneras. So she's continued that. She does hers a little quicker. Those are the daily press conferences. Um, so that really like allows her to speak directly to people, and it allows like her to sort of set the agenda for what is going to be talked about. I would also say that I think because it was the corporate press, like a bunch of the more major figures that were sort of oppositional to Morena and stuff like that have either lost some of their positions on these like talk shows like Denise Dresser or others. So I don't think it's too big of a deal. I mean, you look at approval rating is fluctuating between 70 to 80%. So the communication strategy hasn't changed that much. Regarding the state press or public television, for example, she appointed Renata Turrent, who's the head of Canal 11, sorry, there's a bunch of them, but Canal 11, which is one of the major TV networks, so she's sort of like changing the programming there as well, and so that's where Jose Luis Granado Ceja and Kurt Hackbarth, who are from
Hmm.
Mexico Solidarity, who do the Soberania podcast, they have a new television show with Alina Duarte and another compa who's based in the United States called Sin Muros, which is like without walls, without borders, and so that actually that gets to your question then about like communications with Mexicans in the United States. The program is it's released digitally, so it's to talk to people in Mexico, but also Mexicans in the United States. It's in Spanish and to like to sort of communicate progressively in that way. It's not just a Morena mouthpiece, but it is definitely people who are sympathetic to what's going on. So I think there's that, and there's some other changes at other public television stations as well too, as well. So I think the communication strategy is a continuation of what AMLO was doing, but it's also deepening and making these necessary changes at like public television stuff like that to be more reflective of the process and of what's happening within Mexico and less about the interests of certain media personalities and stuff like that who dominated it before and who were very much opposed to the fourth transformation and Morena and stuff.
And a new generation of Mexican Americans aren't watching Univision anymore, right?
Yes.
But final question, which unfortunately I have to give a very brief response because I have another appointment, which I have to get into. But I have to ask this question, which is the following: when we talk about Claudia, which is do you think under Claudia, if all continues to go well, and the Western imperialists and the far right and their ghastly liberal middle class friends can't find a way to sabotage her, we will see more Mexicans staying in Mexico, not risking their lives to go to the US or some to Canada. And if Trump does outdo Obama, Biden, and his first term, and that's forcibly dump countless illegal immigrants and disrupt a lot of people's families in which you might find kids forcing themselves to move back to Mexico to be reunited with their families. And when they experience wage increases that keep up with their cost of living, the free healthcare, the low cost child daycare, will we see many Mexican workers, mainly of the working class, just flocking over to Mexico, and hopefully many of them being part of Mexican left wing movements, and with that a huge socio-economic renaissance, but also a cultural, and this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, but also a cultural one that will be reflected in film and TVs, talking about Mexico and not just constantly stories about the corrupt drug war, which I think even Mexicans are certainly tired of. I know I'll just say this one last thing. I know there was a backlash against the musical Emilia Perez, which has Zoe Salante and Selena Gomez. I like Selena Gomez's music and her personally as a person, but I can understand why a lot of like Mexicans were just like, really, like another drug war movie, and of course those from the queer community also had some issues, some bones to pick with the movie. So I'm curious your response, that given all of the amazing
Mhm.
policies Claudia is doing, will we actually be seeing more Mexican Americans, especially those of an illegal background, actually coming back to Mexico, and this kind of renaissance in Mexican history?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about the exact numbers, but I think what this has been happening for a while already is that the number of migrants from Mexico going to the United States is like slowed quite a bit, and that's why that most of the people who are crossing the border through Mexico are coming from Central America or Cuba, Nicaragua, El
Mm.
Salvador, Honduras, and stuff like that. Um, and other places. And so I think that that process is already happening in terms of moving back. I mean, if whether, if there are these like ICE raids and things like that, if they significantly pick up the pace of what was already happening under Biden, I think that people will probably make the choice to come back and to take advantage of the programs that's being offered right now for job placements, for money and stuff like that for Mexicans who are returning. So the impact on I don't know what the numbers are explicitly. I don't know if people will do that. I think as other people have made the point more than me that lots of people go to the United States to make money. And not because they necessarily, I mean, not maybe they don't hate the United States, but not necessarily because they're in love with the United States. So I think if people are able to have a good life here, that would reduce the amount of people who might come back. But there's also, I mean, there's still wage differential is still significant, right? So I think probably if you're a younger man, somebody without a family, like an immediate family or something like that, it still probably looks, it can be very attractive to make that much money in the States, and to send money back to your family too. Remittances are still a big part of the economy here, right? In Mexico, money being sent back from the United States. So I don't know. I think it will. The other thing too, though, is like yeah, the Mexican economy depends so much on the United States economy. So if one of the reasons to come back is because the Mexican economy is doing good, but that right now still unfortunately depends on the US economy doing good. So who knows?
Well, it'll be interesting, but hopefully, with a lot a bit, but hopefully, luckily for both Claudia and AMLO, a lot of Mexican Americans are very happy with AMLO and Claudia. So any of them who do have family, who are undocumented and do see a lot of family life and work life and social life disrupted, I would say come to Mexico and actually help out with the left wing movement there. But so that should be quite interesting, and that's why we definitely have to have you and your colleagues from Mexico Solidarity back on in the very near future. Until then, unfortunately, we have to go. But before we go, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, our All Things Mexico Latin America edition with Jay Watson. Let me remind our audience. uh, and yes, and of course, Jay, former central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada, now a full-time member of Mexico Solidarity. He's also a photographer, a historian, all-round leftist people power activist, and Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist intellectual. Jay, all my best to you in Mexico Solidarity. I'll make sure to post the website in case anyone from Yankeeville and Canuckland who are left wing want to be involved, and the other relevant links. And Jay, when we have you back, hopefully the next time we have you back on in the near future, we can talk about more communism related topics, especially the Koreas, Vietnam, May 1968, and popular philosophers like Sartre and communist parties in certain countries and their contributions to people power movements and what distinguishes them from others. But until then, all my best of luck to you in Mexico, and good night and good luck, folks.
Thank you.